Hello, adult Sunday school leader. Do you know what the difference is between a belief and a conviction? Well, a belief is a mental acceptance that something's true. And our churches are full of people who believe that the Bible is God's Word. But a conviction, on the other hand, it's a very strong belief that's characterized by a deep sense of certainty and commitment. Sometimes it's what we would phrase a hill that you're willing to die on. A conviction affects the way you think and the way you act. And again, we have a lot of people in our churches who believe the Bible is God's Word, but it hasn't affected their behavior. It's not a conviction. Now, belief is important. It's a good first step, but we need more than belief. We need conviction. That's what we're looking at this week as we start a new unit called Staying True in a World Far from God. This is the first lesson called Develop Strong Convictions. The focal passage is out of Daniel chapter 1, and the point of the lesson is our convictions, not our circumstances, define who we are. Well, before we get into the lesson, it's important that we get some background on the book of Daniel, especially since we're going to be in it for 6 weeks. Well, God is long-suffering, and He's patient, isn't He? But it's a dangerous thing to rebel against a holy God. In 722 BC, God scattered the 10 northern tribes of Israel because of the Assyrian captivity. Now, you'd think that the southern kingdom of Judah would look and say, well, that's not going to be us. We better get our act together. Nope. In 586 BC, the Babylonian captivity came and took care of Judah. Yes, God is holy and He's just, and sin demands punishment. So the nations of Israel and Judah had to be punished. So He allowed these pagan foreign nations to invade both Israel and Judah and carry them away. But God made a promise to Abraham, didn't He, that the world's salvation would come through his descendants. Severe punishment had to be dealt with, but somehow God had to keep His promise. God wasn't going to allow His people to be destroyed completely. Now, just as God had raised up prophets beforehand to warn Israel and Judah of the impending invasions, He also raised up prophets and used God-fearing people during the time of their exile. Now, for many years, like I said earlier, the Old Testament prophets warned about the impending doom that was going to be coming because of their idol worship, because of their immorality, and because of the way they mistreated the poor. And this doom for Judah came about in 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, the capital of Babylonia was Babylon, he besieged Jerusalem and conquered Judea. And it looked like Yahweh had lost and the pagans had won. But this was God's way of disciplining His children. This began, like I said earlier, what we have come to know as the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians also raided the temple and took some of those articles that were there in the temple for God and placed them in their own God's temple in Babylon. But as always, there was a remnant of people who remained faithful to God during this time. Now, for the next 6 lessons, we're going to be examining the life of one such person, and that is Daniel. So today we're in Daniel chapter 1. Judah has been conquered. Nebuchadnezzar's policy was to take the brightest and the best from a captured people and use them for his benefit. He would train them in Babylonian culture and exploit their strengths and intelligence to benefit his own administration. That's where we begin this week's lesson, in Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. Here, Nebuchadnezzar ordered Ashpenaz, and he was the king's chief steward, to do this, to take some of those captured Judeans and put them into this training program. Now, as a side note here, some translations read eunuch instead of steward, which eunuch is really the literal meaning of this word. However, the term eunuch also included the inner circle of those who served the king, who may or may not have been castrated. Now, notice the qualifications here of the ones who were chosen. They weren't just to get anybody, but it was the cream of the crop. These folks were to be from nobility, without any physical defects. They were to be smart, quick to learn, unlike some of us who think we're smart, but it takes quite a while for things to sink in. They were also to be good looking. Nothing but the best. He didn't want a bunch of ugly smart people or good looking, thick in the head guys. No, he wanted only the best so they could be trained and used in his service. They were to undergo a 3-year time of training, which was primarily Babylonian culture, the language, the literature of the nation. And afterwards, they were to enter the king's service. Now, in verse 6, we're told the Hebrew names of the 4 young men that we're going to be looking at today. Daniel, which means God is my judge. Hananiah, which means the Lord shows grace. Mishael, which means who is like God. And Azariah, which means the Lord is my help. Now, of those names, we readily identify one, which is Daniel. But part of being inundated in Babylonian culture was to receive Babylonian names, reflecting honor to the Babylonian gods, not to the Israelite God, Yahweh. So each young man received the following new names. To Daniel, Belteshazzar, which means Bel, or which is a derivative of Baal. Bel, protect his life. To Hananiah was given the name Shadrach, which means command of Aku, the moon god. To Mishael was Meshach, which means who is as Aku is. And to Azariah, Abednego, which means the servant of Nebo or Nego. I've always thought it odd that we know one of these 4 young men by his Hebrew name and the other 3 by their Babylonian names. Daniel, of course, being Hebrew, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by their Babylonian names. Well, in William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet says these words, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Her point was that Romeo was a Montague, which her family hated. They hated this family. It was his character that made him the man he was. It wasn't his name. He could go by any other name, Smith, Jones, whatever, and his character would be the same. That's the same thing that's going on in our story this week. Our young, good-looking, intelligent Hebrew men are renamed with monikers honoring a pagan god, but that didn't affect their character or who they were. To rephrase Shakespeare, a devout Hebrew by any other name would remain as true. Now, let's look at our next set of verses, which is Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 13. And here's where we get the key thought for this week's lesson, which is there in the first part of verse 8, that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He was resolved, he was determined. Now, studying pagan culture, being retitled with a name honoring a pagan god, okay, that's one thing. But breaking the dietary laws that God gave his people, that was the line that Daniel was not willing to cross. In today's terminology, it was a hill he was willing to die on. But you know what? The king's food, it must have been good. This is the king's food. So it wasn't a matter of quality. I'm sure it was the best that the land had to offer. It was a matter of principle. As Hebrews, they were forbidden to eat certain foods. A couple of examples of what Jews were forbidden included pork, included meat where the blood wasn't drained properly, those kind of things. And most likely, all the foods that were all these foods were sacrificed to pagan gods, which a Jewish person would never consume. So there was no way Daniel and his friends were going to partake in the meals that were provided for them. Now, do you remember a few weeks ago when we were in the holiness study? We were in Romans chapter 12, and verse 2 is the one about not conforming but being transformed. Well, because when we're transformed from within, it changes our thinking. It changes our resolve. So that's something that each of us must determine. What is it that we're willing to stake our lives on? What is the hill that we're willing to die on? What are the principles that we adhere to so strongly that there's nothing that can sway us to go against them? If you feel comfortable, why don't you ask your class that question? You might be surprised at the answers you get. But here Daniel wasn't arrogant about his conviction. And that's something that we can do sometimes is be all holier than thou when it comes to our convictions. He boldly, but he was humble when he asked permission not to eat the food. Because of God's intervention, the guard found favor with Daniel. He had sympathy for Daniel's plight, but was concerned about not only his job, but his life. Because if the other young men grew healthier, while Daniel and his friends lost weight and looked sickly because of this diet, that steward in charge of them was going to have some explaining to do and maybe even lose his life over it. So what did Daniel propose? He proposed a test. Let's try our way for 10 days. A diet of vegetables and water, and then compare our appearance against the other guys. And if we look worse, deal with us as you see fit. So why do you think, why 10 days? Well, it was long enough maybe to see a difference, but not too long so that if the experiment failed, the young men wouldn't be beyond the point of no return. The steward could then pump them full of the other food and get them back to health. Well, I don't know why we skip verses 14, 15, and 16. Because it says that the steward agreed and tested them for 10 days, and at the end of that trial, these 4 young men looked healthier than the others. So vegetables and water it was for them. Well, our last set of scriptures in our text this week is Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 through 19. God increased these young men's capacity for learning. They absorbed everything that was taught to them. And Daniel was gifted with dream interpretation as well. Do you find it interesting, like I do, that Joseph, a Hebrew in a foreign land, was also granted the gift of interpreting dreams? Well, then they all went before the king. If Nebuchadnezzar was going to have anyone in his close circle of advisors, he wanted to make sure that they were going to be a good fit. And they were a good fit. Of this cohort of trainees, no one was found to be better than our 4 Hebrew guys. So remember, it's our convictions, not our circumstances, that define who we are. Don't let the pressures of circumstances or culture dictate who you are or who you need to be. It's the conviction from within that defines our character. Can you think of a time when you made a decision solely based on your religious convictions? Were there any consequences to that decision? Well, this story gives us hope that God helps us and gives us wisdom when we are tempted to conform to the surrounding culture. And that's always been a struggle, the culture question. What do we do with culture? Are we against culture? Do we conform to culture? Well, different cultures aren't necessarily bad, but we must be careful when God's word conflicts with culture. The point of Daniel's story here isn't that we can muster up enough courage and remain faithful. The point is that we are to trust God's word and obey it. So how can we be relevant? How can we be relevant to a surrounding culture that's so different than us without being affected by it? If we are to be holy as God is holy, like we studied in our last unit, then we're to be like Rick Warren said. He said this one time. We're to be insulated, not isolated from culture. Insulated, not isolated. And the example used was being up north someplace where it's really cold. And you can be isolated from the cold. You can stay in the ski lodge, right? You can stay in the warmth of the inside and be comfortable. That's being isolated. Or you can be insulated. You can be out in it and have that parka on that insulates you, so where you're actually in the cold, you're in the culture, but you're insulated from it. And so that's the thing that we need to think about. How can we be not isolated? We don't need to all join a monastery, and go off and live separately. How can we be insulated from the culture? So that's a question you might ask your class as well. And let's remember that Jesus is our example in all things. He came into the culture of the first century Judaism. He ministered in that culture, but he wasn't defined by it. And what were some of those culture-busting actions of Jesus? He talked to the woman at the well. He gave importance to children. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. He was part of the culture, right? He wore the clothes, etc., but he wasn't defined or confined by it. So like I said at the beginning, belief is important. It's a good first step, but we need more than belief. We need conviction. You know what James 2:19 says? You believe that there's one God? good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So pray that your class and you will develop some deep spiritual convictions that won't be shaken. Convictions that will be contrary to a lot of what contemporary culture has to offer as acceptable, but yet convictions that are expressed in a loving manner, not in a combative way. Well, next week we're in Daniel chapter 2, going to be continuing in this unit, in this book, and we're going to be looking at pray with passion. So thanks guys so much for watching. I do appreciate you. Don't forget to pray for and with your class.